Hello, everyone. We are glad to have everybody with us this week for History is Lunch. We're in our home here, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, where you can see today's video as well as all previous and future History is Lunch videos anytime afterwards. I hope that you will consider joining us at History Happy Hour tomorrow, Thursday, April 24th at 5 p.m. This is a free event, starts at 5, with live music, food, a cash bar, and then guests will also be able to join interactive theme tours celebrating the life and legacy of B.B. King and the history of the blues here in the state of Mississippi. Also, this Saturday, we will have on April 26th at the two Mississippi museums, we'll be hosting the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee SNCC Grassroots Organizing Discussion featuring SNCC veteran Judy Richardson and scholar Emily Crosby here in the Neilsen Auditorium, and that is from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. There will be coffee in the morning, and lunch will be served and provided during that. If you'd like more information about either of these programs, I encourage you to go, if you haven't already, to go and like the MDAH or the two Mississippi Museums Facebook pages, the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and you can check out our events page on our website. And then I hope you'll join us again next week, where we will get to have Jeffrey Boutwell and his presentation of George Boutwell Hiding in Plain Sight as they kick off the U.S. Grant Association Conference next week. But today we are delighted to get to have Marion Barnwell and Libby Hartfield with us today. Barnwell is a professor emerita of English at Delta State University, where she taught for 25 years. As a Mississippi Delta native, Barnwell's writing life began at age 13, where she wrote a column for the town newspaper. Barnwell has now authored and edited a number of publications, including serving as the editor of A Place Called Mississippi Collected Narratives, which won the Special Achievement Award for the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters, and Fannie Cook, Mississippi's Pioneering Conservationist, which she co-edited with Libby Hartfield, who will be in conversation with her today. But her 2024 book, All the Things We Didn't Say, 2 Memoirs, is the subject of today's program, and it includes her grandmother's 1956 memoir, published for the first time, which Barnwell both reveres and laments, and which challenged her to write her own memoir. Libby has dedicated 4 decades to connecting people with nature through education and outreach. After teaching high school science, she joined the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science, where she served as the education coordinator and later the director, overseeing the development of the museum's new museum facility at the LaFleur's Bluff State Park and the research addition to that site. Today, she continues to share her passion for wildlife as the co-host of the radio show Creature Comforts on Mississippi Public Broadcasting. So please help me welcome Libby Hartfield and Marion Barnwell to the stage.
That phone makes it sound like we're on the quiz contest. What a nice facility, isn't it wonderful? Drew, we want to thank you so much and all of the people involved with History is Lunch for having us today. It's just a real treat for us to see so many friends and people interested in history and all the accoutrements of history. Thank you. So, where should we start, Libby?
Okay, well, is my mic on? Can you hear me? Okay, good. That's a nice mic. It did no feedback at all.
Shall we tell them how we got to know each other?
Oh, that might be best. We warn them. Yeah, I actually thought there was a danger that you and I would get up here and just have our conversation and forget anybody was here. But no, I think we've got enough friends out there that we want to include you in this conversation. So yes, I hope that we will spark some questions from you, because we don't want to do all the talking.
That's right. But Libby and I met in 2016, I think it must have been. And the circumstances were that our dear friend, our mutual friend, Dorothy Shawn, had just about finished a book on Fanny Cook. Are you going to tell this part or am I?
No, I think you started.
Okay. And so Dorothy died, unfortunately, before she could finish the book. And Libby was thinking, oh, gosh, I've just got to do something about this. And I was thinking the same thing. But we didn't know each other. And who was it that figured out that we needed to get together? Craig Gill at University Press.
Yes, it was Craig, yeah.
So he got us together. I met Libby in a parking lot as she transferred some of the papers to me. And from there, we spent a lot of time on at my dining room table with everything spread out before us, trying to figure out what Dorothy would have wanted us to do to complete the book. And mostly, Libby filled in about Fanny Cook, and I did the documentation. And we were so lucky because we had Kathy Shropshire, who did a one-woman show to accompany all of our book signings. And she just y'all probably remember that. Many of you probably heard her. She just did a wonderful job. And we usually had good crowds. She drew a big crowd. And Dorothy's book, of course, drew a big crowd. So that's how we met. And we've been friends ever since, great friends ever since.
Great conversations, getting ready for all the things you didn't say. But when I read the book, I learned a lot of new things about you. So everybody in here knows more about you if they read the book.
And it's not fair because you know more about me than I know about you.
We'll have to fix that maybe later. But so tell us the circumstances that led to doing this book. This was not on your list, I don't think, of things you wanted to write.
No, it was totally unexpected. It was in 2020, we were all in the, grip of COVID, and we had two family crises. My daughter was diagnosed with breast cancer. She's okay now. And my son announced that he and his wife, long-term marriage, they were getting a divorce. And he's okay now too, by the way. But we were in a crisis, and I had a dream that prompted me to go find my grandmother's memoir. And the dream really doesn't sound like much, but I've been in a dream group for over 20 years, and I knew it was important because it made my spine tingle, woke me up, got me out of bed. And so I went to this secretary that used to belong to my mother, and I inherited from my mother, and dug up Ganny's memoir. And I thought, okay, the dream is telling me that Ganny is going to give me some answers. She's going to provide some wisdom of how to live through a crisis. But on this reading, I thought, she has not told me one helpful thing, not one. And I was just, it's hard to object to your grandmother's memoir. That's very tricky to do. But I did. I thought, she hadn't shared a feeling. She hadn't told me how she felt about her mother. She hadn't told me how she felt about my mother. And so I had this big overreaction. And part of it was because my grandmother and she lived with us from the time I was born till when she died when I was a junior in college. And we had a common problem, which was my mother's alcoholism, her daughter's alcoholism. But we never said a one word about it. And so I think when I had that big overreaction, it was not just because I was looking for something specific in the memoir. It was all the things we didn't say all those years that might have made a difference if we had talked about it. I didn't blame her because I knew, well, I guess I might have a little bit, but I knew that was the way she was brought up. So that's really what prompted me to go to look for my grandmother's memoir. And then after I realized I was having a fit, I decided to write it all down. And so the memoir, this book is really in 3 parts. The first is my grandmother's very short, 8,000-word memoir, but she packs it in with, I'll get to that in a minute, why it's so unbelievably wonderful. The second part is my reaction to her memoir in 2020. And the third part is my memoir, because after I had, voiced all my objections, I thought, well, okay, Smarty, if you're so good at this, why don't you write your own? And I realized it was not that easy. So those are the circumstances.
Okay. And I just realized, okay, that's my first 3 questions you just answered, so we're moving right along. But I do want you to get a little more into, all right, one of the things that maybe the second sentence of her memoir, Ganny says, I'm just going to give you the facts because I'm not a writer.
Right.
Which, as you said, both of those things were both frustrating, and explain that.
And not true.
What was your reaction?
We can unpack that. First of all, I think she was a writer. And I'm going to read a passage in a little while because I think this is the place to do it. At other events where I've given talks about this book, people were more interested in my memoir, I think, because I've got a plot. She has description, which is really harder, but I have a plot. But I thought on this occasion of being here at History is Lunch, I would read from her memoir. And you'll see that it is just the facts in a way. It's also description, but it does avoid her feelings. She does just avoid her feelings. Is she a writer? I object strongly to her saying she's not a writer, but you can decide for yourselves. Now, how many questions have I answered?
Yeah, a couple more. Yeah, so you want to do your reading a little bit? Yeah. And when you told me what pages you were going to write, I said, well, those are the pages that I've got the most underlines in my book, too. Yeah. So I think that makes sense.
So she wrote, the situation was she wrote this memoir for her 5 children at the request of her second son, whose name was Seville. And she gave them the version of herself that they wanted to hear. I taught English for 20 years, 25 years. How many? I don't know. And one of the things I do in writing classes is teach students how important audience is. We are writing for an audience, and we have to know our audience. She knew her audience, and she knew what kind of mother they saw her as, and that's the picture she wanted to give them. So, here's the other thing about it. She wrote it in 1956 when I was 11 years old. And remember, she was living in the house with us all those years. She never closed her door while she was writing. And I think that made a big impression on me. I saw her writing. There were no rough drafts. I could see her looking out the window, contemplating her next sentence, and she didn't write anything down until she had composed it in her head, which is a pretty amazing way to write. And one more thing, after she'd written a completed copy, she then recopied it 4 more times, handwritten for all of her 5 children. And another thing I discovered is they weren't all the same. I began to compare this one to Uncle Bill's, and she had personalized these. She'd put in something about that one, child and one event in each of the memoirs. So for this one, my mother's, she's going to start by calling her by her nickname, Teeny. Teeny, I'll get out the lapboard, pen and paper, and write yours. It will have to be just plain facts, as I don't have much gift for writing. Any talent you all have in that line, you certainly inherited from Daddy. She called her husband Daddy because this was written for the children. However, I want you all to know that from your great-grandparents on down, you come from educated people. They went to college and sent their children to good colleges. They were fortunate in that they were born between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, a prosperous time in the South. Okolona was growing. This is where she was born and raised, Okolona. But she moved around. They were in Verona at one time. They were in Nettleton at one time, and then they settled in Tupelo, and that's where they stayed. This is Okolona she's describing. Okolona was growing at that time. The railroad yards were there, and it was the biggest and best town in northeast Mississippi. I remember the roundhouse full of engines, and we had 2 passenger trains a day. One went north at 10 a.m., one south at 3 p.m. Quite an event, and we always watched for them and waved. On March 12, 1879, Papa and Mama married and went to New York and Niagara Falls on their wedding trip, then lived at the St. Elmo Hotel while the house was being built. I was born there on December 25th. Yes, she was a Christmas baby, 1879. Well, then I started going, oh my God, they were just married. And no, they 9 months and some later she was born. The family physician was Dr. Miller, who married Mattie Harris, a niece of Grandpa Clark's. They were Erskine Miller's parents. Mama was always a bit leery of Dr. Miller. He was an agnostic, and she feared his treatments would not prove effective on that account. But the only other doctor, old Dr. Green, was a confirmed spiritualist, saw ghosts when he went out at night, so Dr. Miller won. I think the first thing I remember clearly was walking to church, a good half mile, Papa with a stovepipe hat and Mama with a bustle. She didn't believe in working horses on Sunday, so we had to walk. After dinner, Papa would hitch Almont, a beautiful thoroughbred, to a gig and take me for a ride, after which, I'm sure, he made for Mr. Milton Brown's racetrack, which was about halfway to Grandpa Trice's country home, 8 miles east of Okolona. When I was 2 years old, Papa brought me those figurines I still have from New Orleans, which I have now. When I was 5, he took me to Memphis and showed me a steamboat, Rosalie. We stayed at the Gayosa Hotel. In a week or so after that, he went to New York and brought me back a brown velvet dress, $25, and Mama a black beaded sealskin coat, $50. This caused quite a sensation in the family. Every time anyone took a trip, they borrowed the coat, and I wore the dress, made over and over time after time till I was in my teens. Then Mama made a silk quilt out of it. We got our money's worth. In those days, groceries were bought in large quantities and kept locked up. Flour in barrels, meal and potatoes by the bushel, 50 cans of lard, vinegar and molasses in jugs. Coffee was green. It had to be parched and then ground and made in a tin coffee pot and settled with an eggshell. There were no bakeries until about 1890. The Dahmers, a German family, came and opened one. Mama sent my brother for our first loaf. It was hot when they wrapped it up, and he sat on the plank walk halfway home and ate it up. Said it smelled so good. Everything was different then. Even the clocks ticked slow and easy. Now they're in such a hurry. When I was 6 years old, the family persuaded Mama to teach in a private school for girls only. Uncle John Trice brought desks and a blackboard, and a schoolroom was fitted up. They objected to the public school on account of boys. That's how Mama's teaching career started. For a year or two, Mama was elected to teach the primary class at the public school, so we were all enrolled there. But the boys and the girls were not allowed near each other, didn't even use the same stairs to chapel. And boys sat on the left, girls on the right, with a wide aisle between. The schoolhouse is there just as it was 70 years ago. At that time, the same custom prevailed in the churches, men on the right, women on the left, women and children on the left. Then there was the Amen corner, where the old men sat and shouted Amen during the sermon. In a big, beautiful old church at Verona, Grandpa Clark, Grandpa Cannon, old Mr. Raymond, Uncle Bob Trice, Mr. Sam Long, and old man Bass composed this corner. None of them wanted Mr. Bass, but they couldn't keep him out. He was a miser, used white sugar himself, and made his family use brown. They talked of ostracizing him. So that's a little taste of Ganny's memoir, but it's so descriptive. I mean, it does give you a real flavor. You know, after all my protesting, I had to reevaluate it and see it for itself. And to me, it's just amazing how much flavor she gives of the times and the places that she describes.
Okay, so we're here in the History Museum. So you started making some context of what the world was like in 1879, just a little bit. But would you talk a little bit more about how your Ganny followed the accepted roles of women at that time, and then were there any ways that she departed? How did she depart? And do you think that influenced the way she wrote the memoir?
I hadn't thought about that last part, but I will. I think that her mother, being the school principal, had a great effect on her. And she was a Victorian. So she would raise her child, as children were raised back then, to be seen and not heard, and to please other people, not to get in people's way, not to talk too loudly, not to smoke in the street for sure. So I think, we take that into account. And and Anna, her mother, must have been a unique person, because back in the day, if you were a married woman, you were not supposed to work. So I think that's why Ganny worded it the way she did. They persuaded her to be the school principal, as if, they had to, twist her arm, because this was not a ladylike thing to do. And so I think that Victorian influence, the angel in the house, which was a very popular phrase back then, pretty much says it all. You were just supposed to be you were kind of supposed to disappear and just show up when it was time to feed people. And so I think that, that's the way Ganny grew up. It was very hard for her to step out of that role. I remember her, kind of quietly going about our house, trying to stay out of my mother's way and trying not to be any trouble to anybody. But she did have a room adjacent to mine and my sister's for the first 7 years of my life. And I remember slipping into bed with her, and she would tell me a poem or rub my back. So she was a very live presence for me all those years, even though she wasn't very verbal about it. Did she step out that role? I think one of the things that her memoir, I think the most exciting part of her memoir, is when she and her father went to Indian Springs, Georgia. Her father had a condition called dropsy, which is pretty closely related to congestive heart failure today. We'd call it congestive heart failure. And a cousin had told him about this cure they were having good luck with in Indian Springs. It's kind of like Warm Springs, but not exactly, because they had this water that they believed that would, be a curative. And of course, Warm Springs was like that too. But this was more like not just getting in the water, but drinking the water. So they just had to drink and drink and drink and drink, this water. Anyway, so my grandmother went with her father. I think it's very interesting that she was chosen to go. She was 20 years old, and not his wife. Anna stayed home. And when she was there, she has this one line where she says, I got to do everything I couldn't do at home, play cards, dance, everything. And then she tells us, and as she's writing for her 5 children, and she tells us, and then I fell in love with my father's doctor. I mean, wait a minute. This is the first time she showed emotion. And I'm just fascinated with that, because this was Ganny's first time away from home and away from her mother. And by the way, she was a wonderful pianist. She did go to college at Belmont in Nashville and study music, and she taught music for a while, and she played beautifully. I do know that. And she played by ear. So my speculation was, what would have happened if she had done something different because of the experience of being in Indian Springs? What if she'd married this doctor? And that's not such an outlandish proposition, because in this same secretary where my grandmother's memoir was a letter from the old boyfriend in Indian Springs, Eugene Elder. And I almost missed it because he scrawled his return address so illegibly that I almost couldn't read it. And then I thought, wait a minute, Eugene Elder, that's the man she met. That was the medical student that treated her father in Spring. And it was just a nice letter, but you could tell Ganny had written to him first. And this was a year after my grandfather died that she wrote to him, as if saying, well, I'm free now, how about you? So I think that was a pivotal point in her life. And by the way, her father got cured from having gone, and he went every summer after that. My grandmother did not go again because she married a year later to this man back home that she'd been pretty much going with since she met him in a strawberry patch when she was 12 or 13.
Okay, so you told us a lot about Ganny.
Did I answer that third part? I don't know that I can, but you had one thing at the end.
Yeah, did the times influence the way she wrote it? She managed to get a lot of, if she never really said she addressed her feelings, I feel like the descriptions were so vivid and colorful that you could read her mind to some extent. But yeah, I thought it was interesting because she acted like she did consider this young man very carefully, and as a 17, 18-year-old, she made her decision to go home and marry the other guy, which...
And actually, there was a fortune teller that I hadn't talked about.
That's right, yeah.
She had an aunt who said, now, before you come home, I don't know how she got this word, because it wasn't no telephone quite then. Before you come home, I want you to go see this fortune teller in Atlanta and see if she's any good. And so Ganny went with her other aunt to the fortune teller, and I guess this aunt was accompanying her or met her in Atlanta. And so Ganny went and had her fortune told, and the fortune teller said, you've been with your father, he's been very sick. That was right. You've met a man that you could love, but you will marry the one back home. So maybe she just trusted the fortune teller. And apparently the aunt thought that was pretty good fortune because she did have hers told too, but she wouldn't tell Ganny what was said about that. So Ganny went home after that, and you could hear a little change in her voice. She became a more adult member of the family because the next thing that happened to the Trices was the grandfather, Zach, got a job in Tupelo, and the mother, Ganny's mother, Anna, got a job teaching school, and Ganny got a job at the switchboard of the new telephone company. And she said, that sounds like more fun than it was, because she could listen in on all the conversations, but she couldn't tell them. But she sounds different because she said she's the one who made the phone call, and now phones were available to them, to Tupelo to see if they could get this house that was becoming available. And she said it scared her to death. But she made just trembling to make this phone call because it was the first time she used a telephone. But she did it and got the house lined up for them to move into. So she did sound more adult after she came back from Indian Springs.
Okay, so she's, again, I said, born in 1879. She gets married in 1900. Waits until 56 to write the memoir, but she does not, in her memoir, she does not address basically the last 56 years of her life.
That's right.
She talks about the marriage. She didn't want a wedding because she didn't want anybody crying, right?
She didn't like to hear people sobbing. She didn't want a wedding, but her husband-to-be wouldn't hear it. He wanted to be married in a church.
And so she moves in with her in-laws, which
after the marriage.
Yeah, after the marriage.
And she describes that. Now, I think this is great too, and this is the way she breaks convention. Anybody who's read Shakespeare knows that these comedies end with the marriage, right? And then in Jane Austen, they end with the marriage. But Ganny took up the next year after her marriage, living with her in-laws, as you said, and just the fun they had. And their fun was to crack hickory nuts and sit around the fire and talk. and read. And they read Quo Vadis, and when knighthood was in flower again, even names what they would read. And they'd wait for the next issue of Munsey magazine. That was the big deal, was to get the new issue of Munsey magazine. And she describes it so lovingly, like she just really liked her mother-in-law, and she just wanted to talk about what it was like to be married, not just to end with the wedding. And even at her wedding, she took a second role because there was a feud between the Clarks and the Trices, my maternal line and paternal line, but her maternal and paternal line. And they had fallen out over some lawsuit that Ganny never explains. And she said they made up at the wedding, so they stole the show, which was better for her because she didn't like the limelight anyway. So that was another departure from convention, I think, just that she didn't like weddings, and she did, wasn't unhappy at all when the lawsuit stole the show, or the actual coming back together, two families.
Well, maybe she had what would have been the reason to stop your memoir at the birth of your first child is basically what it was.
Yeah,
like
too busy.
It was like she became somebody else. She had told them the story of this young woman, but now it was kind of over. She never wrote another word about her life.
That's right. That's why I say hers doesn't get as much attention as mine, because I've got some plot in mine, and she avoids the plot in hers. She avoids the marriage plot, for sure.
Okay, so she wrote her memoir because one of her sons had asked for it, and that sparked it. But luckily, she went on and wrote for all the other 4 kids, too. Why did you write your memoir?
And so, as I said, I had that dream, and I was in the middle of a crisis, and I lamented, that's a good word, I lamented all the things she didn't say, and realized, well, maybe maybe the dream wasn't telling me to go to the secretary and get Ganny's memoir and find the meaning in the words. Maybe the dream was saying, this is a physical thing, and you watched your grandmother write it. You imprinted with your grandmother's ability to sit down and write her story. Maybe that's really the import of why I went to the secretary and retrieved the memoir. I was supposed to write my version of the story. And in a way, Ganny told all the lightness, and I had to tell the dark parts. And so that's what I did.
You saying that makes me think she stopped her memoir when life became complicated.
That's right.
When do you get your problems? When you get children, a lot of it, right?
That's right.
So she stopped, maybe not knowing how to explain any of that. I don't know.
Maybe not, because certainly neither one of us had any tools to deal with alcoholism like we do today. So I began my memoir. And one thing that I find kind of compelling about my story is that I was born in Greenwood, but raised in Indianola, Mississippi. It is the home of the White Citizens Council. And you may already know that, but did you know that there were 2 scholars in the 1930s who wrote about Indianola, Mississippi? One of them was John Dollard, who wrote Caste and Class in a Southern Town. It is Indianola, thinly disguised. The second one, that was in 1937. The second one was written by Hortense Powdermaker, called After Freedom, and she was an anthropologist. Dollard was a sociologist. She was an anthropologist. If I had to pick between them, I would go with Hortense Powdermaker's book, After Freedom, because he lived in the white part of town. Now, one of the reasons I think they chose Indianola is because it was a microcosm. It was an easy to describe microcosm of probably what was going on in other parts of the South, for sure, and maybe other parts of the country. Only 5,000 inhabitants, and it was clearly divided between black and white. The blacks lived on the south side of the railroad tracks, and whites lived on the north side of the railroad tracks. John Dollard lived in a boarding house in the white part of town, and in fact, he lived in the house of my husband's grandmother, Mrs. Kathleen Claiborne. And and he didn't really get to know the people very well. He'd just run in, do an interview, come back to the boarding house and write down what he had found out. Hortense Powdermaker lived with black people in their community and became friends with them and went to church with them and sat on the porches with them. And even then, she had so much trouble extracting information. I mean, they would just rock, and she'd say, "So what are things like? Have you experienced any bad things?" And they would just dilly-dally around until they'd finally say, "Yeah, we've been treated pretty badly." And their stories would come out. And they're just amazing, these stories that she extracted, and they just break your heart. So I was born and raised in Indianola. How could I help but confront at some point what my town was going through? And for me, it turned out to be when I was in 10th grade, and I was in a boarding school in Washington, D.C. My history teacher was named Pat Atchison. She was Dean Atchison's daughter-in-law, and she was the smartest historian I ever met. And all of us girls, it was an all-girls school, we were just in awe of her. We just thought she was wonderful. She would wear mismatched clothes. She didn't care about clothes. She might have on a villager flowered top and kilt for her skirt, not match at all. But we thought that was wonderful too. And she could come in and just lecture on any part of American history without notes. And that too was just amazing. We just glorified her. But one day she came in, I was sitting on the front row, and she pointed at me and she said, "Marion, what is going on down there in Mississippi?" Well, you think I didn't sink 400 yards into the bottom of the floor? I was so embarrassed, and I didn't know what she was talking about. And it was at the moment that James Meredith enrolled at Ole Miss. And she said, "These riots, and what in the world?" And I felt like she was accusing me, and I really felt responsible for the whole state of Mississippi at that point, and really kind of from that point on. So, I was 16 or something like that, and it was I came from a very sheltered place. It was a shock to hear this, but we were kept in a vacuum. We were kept in a bubble. And I'm sure many of you had similar experiences of just waking up to the reality of where we lived. So that was a big part of my memoir, is describing that moment of coming of age.
And returning to Mississippi, I don't know how much more of your story you want to tell. We can.
And I came back to Mississippi. I met my husband in New Orleans. He was working for Boeing, and I was teaching kindergarten at the time. And we did go to Mississippi State, and I loved it, and I got a master's degree, and he hated what he had chosen because it was higher math, and it wasn't exactly what he wanted. And about that time, my daddy got sick and could no longer farm, so we came back to the Delta. And again, I was very troubled by what I saw. And I still am troubled by some of the things that I see, as far as the conflict between black and white. But except for tutoring, which I have done a good bit of, and teaching at Delta State, I don't feel like I've really I can't claim that I've made any difference, although some friends and I did give a party for B.B. King that turned out pretty well. And this was back in the 80s. So B.B. King himself said it was one of the greatest moments of his life to be invited to this party, which we carefully made sure was half black and white, half white, like 150 people, and evenly divided between the races, and everybody had a good time. And this is a mixed thing. It was written up in the New York Times. And I say this was a mixed thing because that sounds pretty good. But when you think about it, it shouldn't have been newsworthy to have an integrated party. So and B.B. King, I'll just go on to say, has done more for Indianola than anybody else could possibly do, because he's brought people in from all over the world and changed the complexity of that town because of it. So I can go to restaurants and go to the community theater and feel like we have a good start on getting together in a better way.
That sounds good. Do you think writing the memoir changed you? How have you changed, if you have?
Yes, it definitely has. See, I think everybody should write a memoir. You really should. If you haven't already, start writing, because it's just a wonderful thing. I think that I began to heal from writing the memoir. I mean, I think healing is a long-term project. It's not just like one day you wake up and feel okay again. But I think it was a long-term project for me to overcome the trauma of my parents' alcoholism. And I think that writing the memoir did an enormous amount of good to me, because now I can embrace the good parts of my mother and daddy, and they were wonderful people. They just had a disease, and they were just adorable. They had a great sense of humor and told all kind of wonderful stories. My grandson just came to see me the other day, and he said, "Gan, I figured out what motivates you. You just like stories." I said, "That's it. That's right."
Do you have any more specific advice if we decided we wanted to write our memoir?
We've been talking about this. I've got a writing group going, and that's fun. And I've taught a couple of memoir classes. And I've been consulting with a real memoir person, Ellen Ann Fentress, and we were talking about this, and she said, start with something concrete. Just start with something concrete, like Ganny did. Just start out with the facts, and then see where it goes, because you'll scare yourself to death if you think, I got to tell my whole life story, now where do I start? Just start anywhere. Just start anywhere. This one woman came up to me after a writing workshop, and she said, I started out writing about blueberry muffins and ended up telling my whole life story.
That sounds like a good way to start.
So blueberry muffins will get for some people. It's just really an amazing journey to write a memoir, because it brings up things you didn't know you were going to say. I mean, I don't feel like I wrote it, really. I feel like the universe wrote it, or something up there, or out there wrote it. I just had my pen in my hand when it happened. It felt like that because I wasn't thinking, about it consciously. There was something unconscious going on.
Okay, I have a couple more questions that I'm going to have to just ask you later. I'm wondering why you didn't tell more about a couple of things in there that I wanted to hear more about. But I think it's time that we start letting our listeners ask some questions. Okay, somebody's already got their hand up.
Hi, I enjoyed your presentation. As for the two books about Indianola,
Yeah.
John Dollard, I think he was not a sociologist, but a psychoanalyst. So I remember William Alexander Percy writing about this sage coming down to psychoanalyze the whole population of Indianola in 3 months.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that always made me suspicious of Hortense Powdermaker is it was William Alexander Percy who brought her in. Now, I appreciate what you said about she actually interacted with African Americans, where Dollard was more just like a clinician, just going to ask questions. But I frankly think both books had good things, but they both missed some things and some prejudices. Okay.
What would you wish that they had asked or researched that they didn't ask or research? I'll just throw it back at you.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I have the advantage of having lived several years after them as techniques have improved. I think I would have appreciated it more if they had, instead of sitting in the rocking chair or just asking questions, maybe participated in the rituals, maybe more participant observation rather than one person sitting there. Let's see if we get a conversation started, the others coming in with some probably pre-written questions.
Yeah.
And I taught at Mississippi Valley State for nearly 30 years and had many a student from Gentry High School in Indianola. And so I'd always go to Indianola with the thought in my mind, okay, this is Southern Town.
Right.
And I think Hortense Powdermaker called it Cotton Town.
She did.
And all. But also, it was to me, well, Clarksdale's really the capital of the blues, but Indianola, because of B.B. King,
Right.
would be next. And I remember...
and Club Ebony is
yes,
in Indianola. Yeah.
Well, I had two social workers in from England years ago. They stayed at my house for a couple of weeks. And after we presented together at NASW and had a weekend together, they took off on an excursion for a few days before coming back to my house. They arrived at B.B. King's Museum on a Monday, and it was closed that day. And some man happened to be going in to check the mail, and he spotted them, and he asked who they were, and they said, well, we're from England. We hope to see this. He said, come on in.
Oh,
So,
good story. I'm glad to hear the ending, yeah.
I'm interested. You said there were 4 similar accounts given to each of the children of that mother. Did the people who received those, did they ever talk to you about them, and are their reaction to how they dealt with that memoir?
Oh, they considered it a sacred text. I mean, they revered their mother, my grandmother, and they considered it a sacred text. They didn't question what she had said. They thought that was wonderful because she'd given this happy person. She described herself as being such a happy, contented person, but I know that she was not always happy and contented. I know that for a fact because I was there. She ends her memoir by saying, don't grieve for me when I die, because I've always been so happy. And that's one of the things I really had to question, because I don't know anybody on the earth that has always been so happy. But she said it for them. She thought that was what they wanted to hear.
I've read a lot of memoirs and done presentations on memoir writing. And, you got the good, the bad, and the ugly when you're talking about memoirs. And I wondered, I have read some that I have said, I don't believe I'd have told that. Did you come across that when you were writing? Were there things about your life that you said, I'm not going to tell that? That's for me and maybe the other person who was involved or whatever that might have been.
Well, you don't want to write about somebody that you don't have permission to write about. If they're still living. If they're dead, I guess it's a free-for-all. But it's really hard, to think about. Once you finish, you start thinking, okay, have I said anything that I will regret? I pretty much told my story, I didn't hold back. I told the good, bad, and the ugly about my story, but I stopped at my children because they have their own stories. I'm not going to tell their story. So that was my one real rule. And now my son is writing his memoir. So I guess I didn't set too bad of an impression. But I'm very interested in that, where you do have to set limits. And what my son is doing is he's going to ask people that he's written about permission to tell their story and send them chapters or whatever that he's written about them and get their approval. The closest I came is writing about Dorothy. I have a whole chapter on Dorothy Shawn, who wrote the book on Fanny Cook. But she had died by the time I wrote her story.
How do your living relatives, you wrote about their parents who are now dead, your cousins, and I felt like you were pretty honest about them. Did they feel good about it?
They were all so supportive. They all just cheered me on. They really gave me a great, wonderful boost. And I have one cousin I don't know at all that has been writing back and forth with me, and we've uncovered some other memories, family memories. My sister, I only have one sibling, is my greatest advocate. She just has liked what I've been doing from the get-go, and she's only taken issue with one thing I said. I said I was the one who made this certain remark on Christmas Day, and she said she made it. So I took it out. I just didn't, fight that battle. But she's a writer herself. I mean, she is a real writer. She's written many books, art history books. and they're this thick, and with lots of footnotes. So she's a real writer, and she thinks it's okay, that this book is okay. So that meant everything to me.
I have a couple of things. One is related to writing the memoir. As when I returned home, one of my brothers was sort of threatening in a fearful and shameful way about that book you plan on writing, just a bunch of lies.
Oh.
So I procrastinating, but I'm working on it anyway.
Good for you.
Yeah.
He'll toughen you up, if nothing else.
None of us can let our siblings stop us, really, can we?
Yes, but it is always probably a fear that you will let some of the family secrets out that they don't want told. But my real question is, my parents also grew up with B.B. King in Indianola area. But my real question is, when your experience in school, when the incident about James Meredith trying to enroll in Ole Miss, and how you felt, and the issue today about the concern for taking history out of the school.
Oh, yeah.
The kind of history that might make the white children feel uncomfortable. Nobody cared about how we felt when it's always been other people's history that
That's
we
right.
had to learn about. So why is it this big concern now? And do you think it's just dumbing down everybody?
We're not going to let it happen, are we?
I wouldn't think so.
I wouldn't
no.
think so either. Yeah.
Thanks. Excellent presentation. I was just wondering if your experiences from your parents or anybody related, did the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s have any economic effect on you, on your parents or anybody? The Great Depression of the 1930s?
My parents were probably, my grandmother writes about hard times in her life. In her memoir, she writes about, I think it was when she was 11 or 12, so that would be in the 1880s, something like that. Yeah. They were really hard times, and they didn't have meat, and they didn't, had to raise their own vegetables. So I know about hard times from my grandmother. I don't know about hard times from my mother and daddy's years, except for one thing. They were married at Middlegate Gardens, which is was a Japanese garden on the Gulf Coast. There's not a single photograph of their wedding. And I think that's because they were too poor to afford a photographer. The man that owned Middlegate gave them the property for the wedding. He allowed them to have the wedding free of charge. So I know that they were going through hard times. This would have been in 1937. So I don't know, because they didn't write their memoirs, but I do know my grandmother's experienced a lot of hard times.
Hello. I just wanted to share a little fun fact. So I'm an economist. So as soon as you said that your grandmother got a dress for $25,
Yeah.
I just wanted to know, like, how much is that now? So I looked up the CPI, and it only goes back to 1913. So had she bought the dress in 1913, it would have cost $816.
Oh, wow.
So probably over $1,000 in today's dollars for your grandmother's
That
$25
was-
dress.
yeah.
So that was pretty impressive.
And they made the most of it. And Libby pointed out in one of our conversations that one of the things my grandmother, and Libby could relate to this because she's a quilter. My grandmother was a great seamstress. She sewed all my doll dresses, and she fixed all, and she made all my dance costumes, and she sewed for other members of the family. And so she was aware of fabric. I mean, that was one of her deals. And at one point, she owned a dress shop in Tupelo. She did work periodically through the years, which her mother broke the mold. I mean, she started it, with her teaching, and my grandmother also worked outside the home at a time when it was hard for women to do so.
Yes, several places in that memoir she does go into detail about the fabrics of something that she wanted to wear.
The Delta element makes me curious. How did your family migrate there? Did your grandmother come with you? And knowing that the Delta really, really has a hierarchy of your family heritage being there a long time, was there a sense of y'all were the outsiders as you moved to Indianola?
My great-grandfather was a newspaper man in Chicago. And I think he must have been alcoholic because he died at 39. And no explanation about that. He died before his son was born. It was called a posthumous baby. My grandfather moved into Greenwood and became a cotton factor in Greenwood and Indianola. He was a self-made man. He came with nothing. And he was a self-made man. He bought up a lot of it. Once he made some money, he bought up land in the Delta and grew cotton and soybeans and passed it on to his sons. So I had before that, my father was William Montjoy Garrard V. There was a William Montjoy Garrard I and on down, and I'm so glad I wasn't a son because that would be a hard legacy. One of them was a captain in the Spanish-American War. One was governor of Kentucky. So we kind of had a nice lineage and in the Delta. And my grandfather became the head of the Staple Cotton Association. My grandmother coming from Tupelo and my mother coming from Tupelo, they had their own heritage. They were. My grandmother actually had a pretty interesting lineage. We were descendants of Melville, writer Moby Dick, if you can believe these things. My grandmother never mentioned it in the memoir, and I don't think she cared. She just didn't want to be, somebody. She was just happy to be anybody, just ordinary.
If you had that in-between memoir of your mother's, that would make that link because she was from Tupelo and married into the Delta. Yeah. And I wondered if some of her early drinking wasn't
I don't think she was prepared for the Delta.
Yeah.
No, I don't think she was prepared for the Delta. In my mind, Tupelo's a pretty wholesome place. I mean, they just didn't have the problems. And I've also thought a lot of times that all the drinking in the Delta was because we weren't looking at the problem, in the elephant in the room. And so I think my mother was unprepared. She thought it was just the most glamorous place in the world. Everybody was drinking. She was going to drink too. So, who knows if she lived somewhere else, if she stayed in Tupelo, what would have happened? I don't know.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to another top of the hour, History is Lunch. Let's give Libby and Marion a round of applause. Libby and Marion will be available. That we have copies of all the things we didn't say, 2 memoirs available for sale, as well as the Fanny Cookbook as well. You can get those copies signed. And if you have other questions you'd like to ask them, they'd be happy to answer them. We hope you'll join us again next week where we will have Jeffrey Boutwell here to present George Boutwell, Hiding in Plain Sight. Let's give Libby and Marion one more round of applause. Thank you guys for being here.